Fantastic. Well, hello, River City. Christine and I are super excited to co-teach this workshop. A lot of you know that we've been friends for 21 years since we met at Northwestern. I was the first one actually that Christine met at Northwestern, and she didn't turn around and walk away, so that's a good sign. But we have actually never co-taught a class, even though we've been roommates and been through a lot of life together. So this is unprecedented for us, to use a word of the year. So yeah, I'm really excited. I'm just as excited to learn from Christine as I am to talk with all of you. So thank you for joining us. This is a part of a series of just practices. And this is related to Sankofa, right? Reaching back to look forward so that we can learn from our history to disrupt some of the oppressions of the past. So the name of our workshops are the historical roots of American oppression and racial capitalism. And so we have a lot there. So this is gonna be some real history. We're gonna start this week with a lot of kind of content heavy. Christine will go into a little bit more, but this is really exploratory and looking specifically at not all of history, but examples of history where we're going to find three things. So the first thing is this coordinated oppression around communities of color. And Christine is going to offer kind of a disclaimer caveat to that, but we're going to see this throughout history, right? That it's not just Black history happening or Asian American history happening. A lot of the systemic oppression, or most of it, is happening concurrently. So we want to just be conscious of that. The second is the linkage between social oppression and economic advantage to whiteness. So we're going to see that interwoven throughout pretty much every example we're going to give you. And then the third point that we want to highlight is that this is cyclic, right? Like, so this coordinated oppression, the link between social oppression and economic advantage, this cycles, right? We'll see throughout history that there's a cycle, and then there's resistance and agency, right? By people being victimized, where they're trying to overcome the victimization, and do make some progress, and then there's a threat, and then it clamps down again, and the oppression then manifests itself in other ways. And so you'll see this all the way from the colonial days up through the 1800s, 1900s, up through now. And so so those are three of the main points. So the coordinated oppression against communities of color, linkages between economic advantage and social oppression, and then this kind of cycle. So just keep those three things in mind. And then Christine, I'm gonna volley it to you to frame up the next part. And Christine is gonna kind of lead us off, and then I will pick up that second half, so.
Thank you, Erin. Good to see everyone here today. Thanks for joining us. I am just going to jump right in. We have a lot to cover. So like Erin started us with, we're exploring the ways people of color have been harmed by coordinated white supremacy. And because the source of evil is one and the same, it's white supremacy, and there's a degree of strategy and exploitation that's tailored to various people groups in various contexts over time in our country, I want to just start with a definition. What is race? What is white supremacy? And I'm going to pull up a definition that Pastor Daniel actually uses in his work on this. So hopefully this works. So what is race? Race is an evil principality that denies and distorts the image of God inherent in all human beings based upon a set of lies that assigns superiority to whiteness and inferiority to Blackness, and which then measures all human value based on perceived proximity to these two poles. So what I want to draw on here, I'm not going to spend too much time because this is just the launching pad to where we're headed, but using this definition, the terms race, white supremacy, and even whiteness, because we're not talking about white people, we're talking about this construct of whiteness, are pretty much one and the same. We're not talking about diversity here. We're not talking about celebrating difference or celebrating different cultures. We're talking about a humanly constructed system that's made up, that upholds whiteness as supreme. So as you look at this definition, you'll see that whiteness and blackness are called out as opposing ends of a spectrum of human value. So for those of us who are not white or black, this can sometimes feel confusing because there's this question of, well, where do I fit in? But I want to be clear, again, drawing on this definition, that whiteness and blackness is not about individual people whose skin tone presents in a certain way. It's not a question of where I fit in based on my appearance or my culture, my heritage, my ethnicity. That's not what race is about. Race is an evil ideology that powers the systems and structures in our country. It essentially says that these systems and structures are designed for white people, for whites only. And so before we go further, I just want to make a couple of comments on the nature of whiteness as a construct that requires anti-blackness as its opposing force. And as a general disclaimer for today, Erin and I are going to be speaking in a very straightforward manner about some very evil and painful elements of our country's history. And, we don't want to engage in any sort of, gratuitous violence towards communities of color as we do this. The reason why we want to do this is we hope that a level of truth-telling and honesty will lead toward, a more fruitful reckoning with the honest reality of this country. And that has to be the starting point for us in terms of repentance. As we acknowledge what's before us in the world, and as we turn towards Jesus, towards the way of Jesus. But that said, some of this may still be hard to hear, and we just want to acknowledge that at the outset. So whiteness, which again, I'll use synonymously with white supremacy and the system of race, was made up at a certain point in history, over the course of history. And the American stream of whiteness was manufactured by white Anglo-Saxons, and this system upheld whiteness as pure, as morally good, and as beautiful, in contrast to this constructed form of blackness, which was seen as evil and ugly and beastly. But the history of whiteness and blackness didn't actually begin in the American colonies. Whiteness began forming into being, which was actually also driven by slavery back in Portugal in the 1400s, when the Portuguese started to conquer the Moorish people in northern Africa and took them as slaves. And the Portuguese actually used a Christian notion of mission as their justification for enslaving North Africans. These are people who hadn't done anything to provoke the Portuguese. The Portuguese came in and conquered as colonial force, conquered their land, and took people from North Africa as slaves. And they started the narrative that Black people were better off coming to Portugal as slaves because at least there they would be saved by Christianity. So I'm not going to go into that part of it much further. If that's something that is of interest to you to learn more about, Willie James Jennings has a book called The Christian Imagination, and the first chapter goes into some really hard detail about the Christian narrative that was formed to support the construct of slavery and the construct of whiteness and Blackness being formed through the Portuguese slave trade. But today we are focusing on the parts of the colonial project that eventually became the United States. So the reason why I brought up Portugal is that there was already a 200-year movement underway in Europe that was cultivating the lie that whiteness was inherently good, and it was closest to the divine even, and that Black people were actually, as hard as it is to say, better off being enslaved because they were seen and portrayed as less than human, portrayed as barbaric, portrayed as in need of salvation by white Christianity. So this is twisted and evil, manipulative logic that was in play. But this logic didn't come from nowhere. In both the Portugal example from the 1400s and the example I'm going to share today about the Jamestown colony in the early 1600s, it started with greed, with jealousy, with lust for money. Portugal wanted in on the slave trade because Muslims had been making lots of money in Africa on the salt trade and on the slave trade for centuries leading up to the 1400s. And the Portuguese had high aspirations to get in on this wealth creation and create their own empire. And so they were trying to colonize all over. They were also in the spice trade in India and beyond. You know, if you remember the term of the explorer Vasco da Gama from grade school, you know, that was kind of portrayed as this like, you know, heroic explorer. This was all part of the same movement of Portuguese colonialism. But again, so that's just context. For today, I'm going to focus in on the story of the colony of Jamestown. So the English elite who started Jamestown in the 1600s also saw the New World as a massive economic opportunity. The competition was heating up as England, France, and Holland joined the colonial race, and they were trying to catch up to Portugal and Spain, who had a head start. They got started earlier. So today, I'm going to start off by focusing on the role of economics and greed in the development of whiteness as an evil construct that depends on anti-Blackness in order to exist. And I'll start off by sharing about the development of racial capitalism as exemplified by the Jamestown colony. And then we'll fast forward to the failure of Reconstruction after the Civil War in the late 1800s. And Erin will share, which I think is just an eye-opening political interplay between Southern politicians who are seeking to protect Jim Crow laws and Western politicians looking to exclude Chinese immigrants who are seen as a threat to white jobs. So she'll explore the linkages between those, and she'll also touch on Mexican deportation and Indian boarding schools that were happening concurrently during the same time in history in the late 1800s. And so through these historical events and policies, which again, this is only just a selection, but we think like a representative selection, we'll see that there is a strategic coordination of whiteness to oppress all people of color, which stems from the construction of whiteness as opposed to the construction of Blackness. And this construction, this made up thing, was formulated and defined within the context of slavery and within the context of Indigenous land theft and of anti-Blackness and of social control. So, oh my gosh, this is like tons of context. But so today will be kind of lecture heavy because we just have so much content to cover and we want to make sure we're kind of starting from a similar place. But next week, if you're able to join us, we'll build from what we learned today, and it'll be much more interactive. We'll kind of look at some of the more modern manifestations of this cyclic and coordinated oppression and of racial capitalism that we can see in our own society today, and we'll have a little bit more time for discussion. All right, so we talked about the definition of race. And I've thrown around this term racial capitalism. So I want to just start first with another definition of that I've created in terms of my own working definition of racial capitalism. So let me go ahead and pull that up. All right, there we go. So racial capitalism. See it as the ideology which upholds capitalistic gain as supreme and perpetuates the lie of white supremacy as a primary tactic to reinforce a now global system of consumerism, politics, social constructs, and even religious systems that serve to protect and grow the wealth of the elite through exploitation and oppression of people groups, primarily based on race. So capitalism is a loaded term, and I feel like it's being thrown around a whole lot more these days. And I just want to be clear, I'm not really concerned about debates about different economic systems, whether socialism or communism or capitalism works best. I'm concerned with the way that America's system of capitalism, which is now a globalized economic system serves to keep us bound and stuck in white supremacy. I think they're tied. And capitalism does so because its success, the success of capitalism has always depended upon the evil of race. And that is as true today, I believe, as it was 200, 300, 400 years ago. And from a theological perspective, I believe it's necessary to be honest about the trappings of racial capitalism, because it's impossible to unquestioningly accept the ideology of capitalism as good and even as Christian without also being complicit with white supremacy. I think they're totally linked. In our context, capitalism upholds the system of race, and the reverse holds true. The system of race upholds capitalism. So in America, this all starts with slavery and with land theft. Now, whatever we think this country is, whether, however we experience it, both slavery and land theft are an integral part of our understanding, whether we name it that way or not. If we see America as a land of opportunity, slavery and land theft are at the core, they're at the center of that view. Because America's economic success, which provides economic opportunity for so many people, my family included, was built on enslaved labor and stolen land. And on the other hand, if we see this country as imperialistic and oppressive, that also starts with slavery and land theft. So this is where we're going to start our exploration today, is with kind of digging into these two things. And the story of Jamestown can help us understand the origins of racial capitalism through slavery and land theft. It's kind of like a microcosm of the core processes of racial capitalism at work. And so we'll learn about this story, watch a short video clip to help us with Bacon's Rebellion, which is a big part of it, and then I'll hand it off back to Erin. So here goes. Here's the story. Jamestown, the first colony by the English in what is now the United States. So that back in 1607, about 100 men and boys arrived from England at Jamestown, Virginia, and they were charged with starting a settlement through a venture that was funded by the Virginia Company. And so they chose a spot that was easiest to defend against possible attacks from the Spanish. They were worried about the Spanish encroaching on their colonized territory, and from the local Powhatan tribe whose land they had taken. And it didn't take long before these men started dying from illness, from famine, from attacks. The death toll was really, really high. Some estimate that 80% of the original men who came had died within just a few short years. So they were about to give up. This was it was a venture capitalist thing. They were about to give up, but things turned around when a new strain of tobacco was planted, and this ended up turning a profit. It became a profitable cash crop for the Virginia Company. So again, Virginia Company, these are venture capitalists from Britain who are anxiously awaiting their return on investment through this colony at Jamestown. So the company began sending English, white, indentured servants to work the land, because there was tons of land to care for at Jamestown, and there were very few people to do it. And it worked out in terms of, what was in the best interest of the Virginia Company, because England was just coming out of an economic depression. And so there were lots of laborers in the country with no jobs. And for them to receive passage to America, which was otherwise exorbitantly expensive if you're paying out of pocket, was worth the risk for many people, even though you were a servant by contract to the company for at least 5 to 7 years. And even though people were dying at such high rates in Jamestown, there were still many people who chose to dedicate their lives in this way. So in terms of this context at Jamestown, I think it's important to recognize that a colony was founded by venture capitalists. Again, money was always at stake, and that white indentured servants made up the labor force of the new tobacco industry in its early years. And then came 1619, which many of us know is the year when a group of 20 Angolans landed in what is now the United States. And they came to Jamestown kind of by accident, because English pirates attacked the Spanish enslaving ship and then sold the group of 20 people to the Virginia governor. But these first Africans who landed at Jamestown were not immediately treated as slaves in the way that we, looking back on history, currently conceive of chattel slavery, the slave block, and the Cotton Kingdom at its peak. The Africans were actually not treated too differently from the white English indentured servants who chose to make their passage and fulfill their contracts with the Virginia Company. They basically shared their lowest class rank in the colony. And their class rank was actually more powerful than the notion that race had not yet entered the consciousness of the indentured servants, both white and black, because that was not used to oppress or divide. Everyone who was an indentured servant was seen as the same, as the kind of the bottom rung of society in Jamestown. But that all changed in the years leading up to Bacon's Rebellion, which took place in 1675. So this is, almost 70 years after the first settlers came to Jamestown. And this is when racial capitalism also really took hold. There was a quote that I had seen in Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, that I thought was really powerful. Just want to share that with you all. So before the narrative of racial difference really took root, this is from historian Lerone Bennett. And they write, back there, before Jim Crow, before the invention of the Negro or the white man or the words and concepts to describe them, the colonial population consisted largely of a great mass of white and black bondsmen, indentured servants, who occupied roughly the same economic category and were treated with equal contempt by the lords of the plantations and legislatures. Curiously unconcerned about their color, these people worked together and relaxed together. So that just kind of summarizes it. The narrative of racial difference had not yet been a thing. What was more important to the indentured servants was their shared experience as labor for the elite planters. So what I'd like to do next, I'm going to show a video clip that helps explain what the political situation was like leading up to Bacon's Rebellion. It's not super short, it's like 7 minutes long, but it really helps to kind of tell the story here and all the political and social dynamics. So let me go ahead and get this started.
But as we think about the way power was distributed in Virginia, you can guess who might have a lot of say in the House.
Hopefully this reloads soon.
House of Burgesses, and these are the tobacco planters. So the government of Virginia, although it is a democracy of these landowning men, is still got most of the power at the very top. Because as we talked about in the last video, the power system in Virginia looked like a handful of planters at the top, a very small number of free white farmers who had their own land, but nothing like the gigantic tracts of tobacco plantations that the planters had. Then a whole lot of white indentured servants who have very little political power, since they are at basically the mercy of the planters. And then just a tiny handful of black slaves. And in this time period, white indentured servants and black slaves, black free people, also a tiny number, didn't have that much difference when it came to political rights. In fact, white indentured servants frequently complained that they felt that slaves were treated better than them, which may have been the case because they were worth more. Remember, they were worth hundreds of pounds, whereas white indentured servants cost just a couple of pounds to come over, frequently died, so they were less of an investment than slaves. The other important factor here is just what it takes to grow tobacco. Tobacco is a labor-intensive crop, we know, but it's also kind of a crop that is extremely hard on the soil. It depletes the soil fast, which means that there is a constant need for new soil. And when you're coming from the coast, here's our Atlantic Ocean over here, and this is Virginia, and our Jamestown colony along the river, James, more and more planters as they come over. Remember, we have this head right system. We have a system that says that if indentured servants finish out the terms of their indenture, they get land of their own. It means there is constant pressure to add more and more land so you can farm more and more tobacco. You start going farther and farther into the interior. So what does this mean? It means that land becomes relatively scarce pretty fast. And it also means that as white settlers continue to move west toward the Appalachian Mountains, which are over here, I hope you enjoy this beautiful map, certainly a work of art, they are running up against more and more anger and conflict with Native Americans who are living in between the coast and the Appalachian Mountains. And now it's definitely in the interest of the House of Burgesses, the government here at Jamestown, to make sure that there's as little conflict with Native Americans as possible. Remember, we had these wars of extinction with the Powhatans. That wasn't a fun time for anyone. And so the House of Burgesses, which is now somewhat responsible to the King of England, since he acquired it from the Virginia Company as a royal colony in 1624, they have a relatively friendly attitude toward the Native Americans. They're hoping to avoid conflict. And so their Governor William Barclay, spelled Berkeley but pronounced Barclay, I don't know why. He refuses to take on another war of extinction against the Native Americans, which makes a lot of white servants and white freemen pretty angry. It's the late 1600s now, and more of these indentured servants are living to finish out their terms of indenture. They've now built up some immunity to these diseases that have killed so many other people in Virginia, and they're finding it really hard to make a living because the planters don't want to give quite so many rights, quite so many perks to people who live out their indentures. Remember, this was a good deal for planters when these white servants never actually survived to make good on the promises of land. And now that they are, planters don't want to extend them things like a promise of land because land is already scarce. So when servants are finishing up their indentures, they're finding it difficult to make a living. They often have to continue to work for the planter they had been indentured to for very small wages. They don't have land of their own. They can't get started. And this is a world composed almost entirely of men, so they can't even find women to marry. And I think if there's anything we've learned from U.S. history, it's that you never want a whole lot of unemployed, angry young men hanging about, because young men with a lot of time on their hands get up to trouble. And one young man in particular was this fellow here, Nathaniel Bacon, who was incensed at Governor Barclay's refusal to take a harsher stance against the Native Americans on the West, where all of these white farmers wished that they could settle. And so he gets up a militia full of young white men and also African-American men to actually go after the Native Americans. So this is a biracial raid force for Native Americans, and they raid Native American villages and kill many Native Americans living in the area, and Governor Barclay wants them to stop. And instead of stopping, they march to Jamestown, the capital of Virginia, and set it on fire. So this is a group of landless white men, landless African American men who have rebelled against the government of Virginia. Oh, these are my flames, the House of Burgesses. They run Berkeley out of town, and it's hard to know where this would have ended because Nathaniel Bacon himself died. And he died of illness, like many other Virginians in this time period. So the rebellion kind of petered out without his leadership. But clearly, this was a really scary moment for the House of Burgesses and for the leaders and planters in Virginia. And they started to think, all right, well, maybe this indentured servitude thing isn't working out so well because once these indentures are up, we've got this whole set of landless free whites who technically have the rights of Englishmen, but we have little work for them, we have little land for them, and it's going to end up with constant rebellion. So maybe we should think about a different source of labor, one that will never get its freedom. And it just so happened that there were many such laborers for sale on the coast of West Africa. And we'll talk more about that in the next video.
All right, so there was a lot that was covered there, but I want to hone in on the fact that Bacon's rebellion was a group of landless white men and black men who rebelled against the government because they joined forces to seek opportunity. They could see that their labor was putting money in the pockets of elite planters. They wanted the chance to have land for themselves and to build a living for them on their own. So, you know, she also mentioned about the fact that there were some white indentured servants who complained that black slaves, and again, this was a complicated time. I think there were some African Americans who were enslaved. There were also some who were not. So the terminology gets a little tricky during this time in the 1600s. But she mentioned how white indentured servants complained that they were treated worse than black indentured servants, because the elite just didn't invest much at all to keep the white bondsmen in particular alive. But after the rebellion, the planter elite realized that indentured servitude was not going to be a long-term solution. There was going to be ongoing chaos. There was already so much, discontent and, to a very extreme level that was occurring within the lowest class of the society that they had created. So they wanted to create, the planter elite wanted to create a sense of stability for themselves while still achieving their financial goals. This is still a capitalist venture. So the video ends with a comment about elite planters looking to African slavery as the answer to this problem, to have enslaved labor and to have that level of control. And that is the primary storyline, that after Bacon's rebellion and after a few more things happened, that slavery really started to take off. But there are also a couple of concrete ways that the development of racialized narratives and the differentiation between whiteness and blackness played a huge part in this story. So, as labor demands increased along with opportunity for profit, there were two policies in particular that, in my opinion, forever implanted the system of race and its resulting economic and social devastation as part of the foundation that this country is built on. So the first thing I want to point out, the planter elite began sowing seeds of division between white and black laborers by creating differentiated punishments based on race. Again, as we saw in that quote, as we've been hearing from these different historical perspectives, white and black folks who were serving at that same level at the lowest rung of society didn't really see race as a thing that divided them. They were more united based on their shared experience. But then the elite started inflicting different punishments. So when indentured servants tried to run away from the colony, English runaways they simply had additional years added onto their contracts. But African runaways were sentenced to servitude for life. And this was, again, before slavery was fully instituted. So differentiation and punishments. And then on top of that, Ibram Kendi writes about how in 1660, when the first official recognition of slavery was released, it said that any white servant who is running away, quote, in the company with any Negroes shall serve for the time of said Negro's absence, even if it meant for life. So if you were a white servant and you got caught with a Black person in your runaway group, you would have to serve the amount of time the Black servant was gone. So this was an intentional effort to divide white people from Black people, and also to create a new class or a new caste of people. The white workers were given a higher rank than the Black servants or the Black slaves. And this didn't happen naturally, it was intentional through policies such as the one I just described, with a difference in kind of the coordination of punishments. And so this divide was really completely finalized in the coming years when free white workers were granted, they were finally granted access to land. And this was an opportunity that was completely denied the Black slave class, well, the Black indentured servant class. Again, it was really complicated. The Black folks were not, people were not able to have access to land, while white indentured servants were. So again, intentional effort to manufacture the narrative of racial difference that placed whiteness as superior to Blackness. And it was motivated by the desire of the planter elite to maintain social control. As again, they sought to just run their tobacco plantation and have an ongoing, growing return on investments in this colonial project that's called Jamestown. And so there's a second policy. And again, I kind of talked about at the beginning how some of these things that we're going to be talking about are really painful to hear. But as years passed and more women were brought to Jamestown, there soon became a question of status for children who were born to Black mothers and white fathers. And so English common law had always said that the status of the child was connected to the status of the father. But starting in 1662, so again, this is the time when the notion of chattel slavery, enslavement of Black Americans, was starting to pick up. In Virginia and then later in other English colonies, all children were considered to follow the status of their mothers. Again, complete reversal from the way that things had always been in England. This was a strategic and calculated decision to serve the best interests of the planter elite. And so children of enslaved mothers were automatically born into slavery, regardless of who the father was. And those born to free women were born free. And so this meant that, again, to state the obvious, if a child was born to an enslaved woman, that child would also be enslaved labor. And you can kind of see the logical progression that stems from there. If you are interested in having as much access to free labor as you possibly can in order to make as much money as you can on the plantation, you have incentives to rape Black women, to do whatever it takes to have as many people born into your group of enslaved individuals. And so this started just an extremely violent and horrific attack on the bodies of Black women that has continued to manifest in different ways today. So before we kind of close out, I just want to pause there for a minute. I just covered a lot. Just want to invite you to feel whatever it is that you're feeling. Let yourself name whatever questions you have that might be floating around, and we'll hopefully have time at the end to get to some questions. But this was just in my view, just a very evil and again, calculated and coordinated process of the 1600s of colonialism, of white supremacy really coming into full force, of defining whiteness as opposed to Blackness. And the Jamestown story really kind of tells a whole lot of that. So I will end with one more quote, and then I will pass it off to Erin. So again, this comes from Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow. And if we fast forward, so again, we were in the 1600s. A whole lot happened in the 1700s, formation of the nation, 1800s, really when the Cotton Kingdom took off, Civil War in the mid-19th century, a couple of decades of Reconstruction when there was a small inkling of hope, and then there was post-Reconstruction, 1880s, when Jim Crow really took effect. So she says, segregation laws were proposed as part of a deliberate effort to drive a wedge between poor whites and African Americans. These discriminatory barriers were designed to encourage lower class whites to retain a sense of superiority over Blacks, making it far less likely that they would sustain interracial political alliances aimed at toppling the white elite. The laws were, in effect, another racial bribe. And as William Julius Wilson has noted, as long as poor whites directed their hatred against the Black competitor, the planters were relieved of class hostility that would really otherwise have been directed toward them. So with that, we kind of see the, again, this very intentional, deliberate divide that was created through the construct of policies and practices to turn poor white Americans against African Americans. And we'll see, as Erin kind of picks it up from here, we'll see that that was also expanded to all people of color who were seen as a threat to lower class white people in particular, and the kind of the maintenance of the sense of white supremacy. Sorry, that's my kid. I'm gonna hand it over to you, Erin. Children are banging on the door.
Thanks so much, Christine. This was so good. So we're going to take everything that we absorbed from kind of the colonial period and the 1600s and kind of go all the way ahead to around the 1800s. So want to frame this up as concurrent, right? Like what is happening to different communities at what time? And so as we have kind of the height of, even though 1808, the international slave trade, right, is deemed illegal, we have a boom of 1 to 2 million enslaved people after, right, those laws, due to the cotton gin, due to the enslaved families increasing and continuing to be held in bondage. So during this period, we have the Black community enslaved throughout all parts of the South. And then you think about the 1830s, what little Native American indigenous population is left that hasn't been decimated is now being told by Andrew Jackson that they need to be like moved around, right, in the 1830s. And this moving around also entails a dehumanization of Native Americans so that there's a justification, right, in taking land. And so we go from the 1830s to, I want to focus in more on the 1860s before I really get into our next multimedia. So this is complicated, right? Because when we think of who's president, right, and during the Civil War, it's Lincoln, and we tout him for the Emancipation Proclamation, and we tout him for, really being enlightened in terms of, well, eventually, actually, even Lincoln had to kind of come to the, it took about 2 years and in the middle of the Civil War to come to the stance that slavery is evil and needs to be abolished. At first, he was kind of more of a gradualist, right? So even then, in 1862, Lincoln authorized one of the largest mass executions of Native Americans. It was like 38 from the Dakota tribe, and this was in Mankato in what is now Minnesota. And these 38 Dakota men were accused of being rebels, right? They were not allowed due process, were not allowed, trials. They were just kind of summarily executed. And then the criticism is that, hey, Lincoln really didn't treat the Confederate officers the same way. So you have these complications with Lincoln, right? Like he gets to this point where he's like, yeah, slavery is an abomination and it needs to end, and we're willing to fight a war over it. And at the same time, there's also oppression and suffering and murder of Native Americans. Okay, so continuing on in the Civil War the war does not really turn until Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, really freeing no one, right? Freeing the enslaved people in the South who were still enslaved. And then nobody above the Mason-Dixon line was technically freed. But this did bring about a mass, he did agree, it took a while here too, to allow Black soldiers to serve in the Union Army. And this is really when the Civil War changes. And I bring this up to say that, you know, we were talking about cycles of oppression, and I want to also highlight that there are these very cogent periods of resistance, right, and of fighting back. And here we see this with Black Union soldiers as well. And so we're gonna continue to talk about that agency as we go along, and you'll see it too in the clip that I'll show. But I just want to highlight that that's also part of the story. But then every time that there's like an opening, if there is an economic threat, that gets squashed, right? And then so just to set up, I have a really cool clip to show you in a minute that kind of brings a lot together. But I want to also highlight, you know, what is going on during Reconstruction, right? So 1865, Union wins the war, enslaved people are told they're free, not really given a lot of support, but there was the Freedmen's Bureau up until Andrew Johnson authorized the pulling out of the Freedmen's Bureau in 1866. But what that did was try to give a boon, right, to people who were formerly enslaved. So what happened during Reconstruction, right, is that you have the passage, this is a period of about 1865 to about 1877. And so you have a period, right, where Black people are enfranchised, just huge communities of formerly enslaved people voting. And I know that a lot of you know that there were Black legislators, and I just want to show you about how many. I'm going to pull up this. Let's see. So here are Black office holders by state. Let me see if I can get the screen share right. All right, can you see this? So this is Black office holders in the South during Reconstruction. So you see Alabama has 173, right? Arkansas, 46, North Carolina, 187. These are federal offices over here. Of course, this is only Black men, and because that we know that opportunity for women of color did not come until much later. But this is an example. Hiram Revels, who was the first Black congressman elected to office, was elected in 1869 and then appointed to the Senate in 1870. And so you have this flourishing of Black lawmakers due to Black enfranchisement. And then by the time 1877 rolls around, there's this kind of perceived threat. Oh my goodness, Black politicians are gaining too much power. The Black electorate is gaining too much power. Whites are feeling threatened. And so they're able to lobby on the basis of state rights to kind of kick federal officers out. Federal government probably way too compliant. In 1877, the last federal troops leave the South. So basically all stability when it comes to enfranchisement of Black Americans is gone. And by 1880, it's either 1880 or 1881, I believe you go from all of these office holders, like literally in the hundreds, to zero, to no Black legislators in Congress and barely any in any state houses. And then we know what happens with Jim Crow, right? So I want to use that to set up this next clip, because as this is going on, right, as Reconstruction is collapsing, let me go back to gallery here first. Oh, wait, how do I, stop share? Okay, so as Reconstruction is going on, right, we're looking at the, which is about 1865 to 1880, you have this enormous integration of Chinese from China, right? Because they're hearing, oh, there's gold there. And then as soon as some Chinese immigrate and find opportunity, I mean, being Chinese American myself, I could tell you the Chinese network is strong. It doesn't need an ocean to block it. You're gonna be able to get the word out to your family. Come on over. There's work on the Transcontinental Railroad. There's opportunities with the gold rush and mining. And so at the same time you're having Reconstruction and the flourishing of the Black community in the South, you're also having a flourishing and an emergence of an Asian American community in the West. And so we're going to look at a video that kind of picks up where the Chinese in the West have gotten so economically powerful with their entrepreneurship and jobs like mining and basically there was not much that was closed to them at first, but they were becoming such a threat to white labor that white labor instituted all these rules like, oh, if you open a store, it has to be within this square footage. So like the emergence of Chinatowns, right, is not just because Chinese people like to gather together, it's because they were restrained by covenants and city ordinances to only be able to open like a laundry and only be able to open a laundry in a certain area, for example. So thus stripping them of mining jobs and jobs that were more lucrative economically. And so I want to show you a video. It's about a 15-minute clip from Amend. I think it's pretty illuminating. And it picks up, we learn a couple of things from this documentary called Amend. One is that Will Smith never ages. He looks just like he does in Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. He's hosting this. And number two is that he picks up right after there's a Chinese massacre in 1871 in Los Angeles, where about a mob of 500 local white people who were already antsy that like, oh, these Chinese are coming over and taking our jobs. There was some kind of dispute between two Chinese tongs, and they used it as an excuse to basically start lynching Chinese off the street. And there were as many as, the estimates are like 20 to 30 something Chinese who were lynched in that one night. It's really, when you think of the Tulsa massacre in 1921, that is an echo of what happened in 1871. One thing I want to mention that this video doesn't mention is that we'll hear more about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which lasted for 61 years between 1881. Guess what happened in the 1880s? Reconstruction collapse. At the same time, the Chinese Exclusion Act is then implemented on the federal level, where the president at the time, I think it was Chester Arthur, said that basically banned all Chinese immigration. It was renewed every 10 years until Congress made it permanent, and then was not lifted until 1943. So my point here is keep in mind that as Jim Crow is going on, the Chinese are being excluded. You've got Southern lawmakers who are kind of dealing with Western lawmakers. So the Western meaning, people from the West Coast. So you have Southern lawmakers that have to renew this act every 10 years, who have never in their life, there were Chinese in the Mississippi Delta at one point, but not here, but they had never in their life had met somebody who was Asian at all, saying, okay, well, we'll go ahead and renew your Chinese Exclusion Act if you don't send kind of federal oversight to us and kind of let us have our Jim Crow laws. So there are all of these kind of coordinated elements of oppression. So just think about that when you're watching this. So, okay, I'm going to show you a clip. Keep in mind the three things that we were talking about. It's 15 minutes, but it's really worth it. So think about, how are communities of color being oppressed concurrently? How is this happening? Number two, how is economic advantage linked with social oppression? Okay, and number three, how is this cyclic? How does this echo what Christine talked about in the 1600s? And how is it playing out in the 1800s and the 1900s? And how do we see it manifesting today? Something that we're going to go more into next week. So, all right, let me go ahead and play this for you. Oh, yes, and one more thing. Sorry, so many things. The first Indian boarding school was set up in 1860, and they lasted all the way in critical mass till about the 1950s. So this is when the government conspired with Catholic denominations and Christian denominations to basically reallocate, or I don't say reallocate, basically move indigenous children. They did not have to have the consent of their families. This was not a law until 1978 that said that families actually had to give the okay. So they were able to pluck indigenous children from their homes, put them in these boarding schools, cut their hair, dress them in Americanized clothes, strip them of their language in order to quote unquote kill the Indian and save the man. And so this was also a form of social control, right? And I believe the justification is so that we could have some continued land control and land takeover as well. So anyway, so this is all going on. The Indian boarding schools isn't mentioned in this clip, but know that this is also going on concurrently. There's a lot of other things. So all right, here we go. This is from Amend, and keep in mind, I'm sorry, I keep teasing. Okay, so a lot of linkages there from those three main points that we were talking about. During this whole time, we have Indian boarding schools. And on top of that, about a decade after Mexican repatriation, was the Urban Relocation Act, which then tried to move or incentivize Native Americans to relocate into urban centers, into cities, and without very many resources at all. A lot of you probably know about the Native American Center that used to be in Uptown, and that was a community-based center that came because so many Native Americans were relocated to Chicago and really ill-equipped to deal with the circumstances. So again, moving around of one group, and it's a kind of a systemic moving around of one group based on economic need, right? Of who has social control and power. And it's all kind of tied to economic incentive at the time. And so yeah, this is a lot. We went a lot of 1600s, a lot of 1800s. And I'm wondering, from all of you, as you're kind of processing this, what are some things that you're thinking about that are kind of going through your mind, questions of clarification you might have for Christine and me, just thinking through these pieces that we've brought up and kind of the history that we've gone over tonight. What did you maybe not know that you know now that you're kind of thinking about? So anybody want to share? Or I can call on you.
A number of things jumped out for me. The first was that 1662 switch from common law to status of status of the mother. And just a number of other facts that kind of, if you're someone who knows history, you're going to see it pretty clearly. That's, I don't know, frustrating when thinking about family or past conversations of those who wanted us to learn our history, but didn't want us to see kind of what you're making pretty clear. So.
Really good. And before somebody else shares, I just want to emphasize that. So the reason why the Chinese Exclusion Law was finally, the Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed in 1943 is that America was 2 years into World War II, and China was our ally at the time. And it's not the greatest look geopolitically to not allow any immigration from our allies. And right around the same time, of course, FDR made an executive order interning Japanese Americans as well, Japanese and Japanese Americans. So it's almost like trading one type of oppression for the other. And just to note that the Chinese Exclusion Act actually affected it suppressed Asian immigration from other countries too, from Korea and the Philippines and Japan. There were national quotas all the way up until 1965, which thanks to the modern civil rights movement and the Immigration and Nationality Act abolished national quotas. And that's why we've had this flood of Asian American and Latinx immigration since then. And so a lot of the times we wonder, we look at our people of color populations, our BIPOC populations, and we're like, oh, why is the Asian population only at 5%, right? And this is a big reason why, because there was this exclusion in place for decades. Otherwise, we could have had potentially more flourishing. Or same with Latinx population, when you see 1 to 1.5 million Mexican and Mexican Americans deported. So yeah, so anything else? What else? Thank you, Michael, for sharing. Anything else that's kind of rummaging through your mind that you're processing right now?
I think one of the things I've been thinking about is, or one of the things that I hate about this history. I love the way you presented it, but I hate this history is that um, it constantly reminds me we didn't start with hate. We may have started with discomfort and fear and anxiety, but we didn't necessarily start with hate. But hate was built, we were taught to hate by like this methodical, structured strategy that would implement laws and a sense of zoning and order, and then a regular amount of propaganda that eventually produced where we are now. And it's obviously deeply disturbing, but it's really disturbing that it could have been different. And it reminds me a little bit of Shamika's question. I remember she asked a long time ago of how has white supremacy hurt white people? And I think that's part of it, is that we have inherited and taught ourselves to hate in a way that is very hard to untangle, because we've inherited this history. And it's deeply embedded. And it could have been different. It could have been much different.
Thank you for that, Joshua. And it has suppressed the flourishing of every people group, right? In many senses, and then aligned, marginalized white groups like Christine was talking about with whiteness, is a matter of both survival, maybe, but also superiority as well. Anybody else want to chime in? Maybe one more thought?
I just needed some clarification. I don't understand how the jump happened between having a militia, although what they were doing was completely wrong, but having a concerted militia of Blacks and whites, impoverished people, to being completely on different tracks. I don't understand how the jump happened. I think that was at the end of what you were sharing, Christine.
Christine, yeah.
Yeah, I'll admit it's been challenging actually with what Michael shared about, like, if we only knew our history. It took a lot of effort to piece together the different parts here, because there are very few historical accounts that actually tell the story in this way. And so I hear you. There's some choppiness to the story. From the best I can gather, which again, I feel like I'm just scratching. I'm like at the tip of the iceberg here too. Is that it was a slow movement. So again, obviously there's just a sense of otherness that happened when the 20 Angolans arrived or landed at Jamestown. But there was still kind of, again, that shared experience of oppression. And so there was some camaraderie there. But then it was complex, because then I don't know exactly how it happened and exactly what order, but there were some people of African descent who were enslaved. There were free people of African descent, and there were indentured Black American or Black Africans as well. and so in terms of the jump that happened, I think there was like this just this mixture of all these different dynamics happening, the best I can understand. And the rebellion was kind of somewhat of a catalytic moment in time, because it really kind of raised the incentive of the elite planters to like do something about it. Like, we can't just let this slide. We can't let this keep going as it is, or else we're gonna lose. But yeah, I wish I had a better answer. All I can tell is that it's complicated, and there was this gradual evolution there. Yeah,
Thanks.
Thanks so much. Hey, Pastor Daniel, since you joined us, I'm going to call on you. Anything kind of percolating in your head? I know you've been doing this work and thinking through this for the last few decades, but anything maybe new or surprising, or any other thoughts that kind of jumped in your head during our session?
Well, thank you to both. I thought this was really fantastic, informative. I learned a lot. I think one line towards the end, was it Will Smith who said it? But it was one of the professors in that. But anyway, that notion that it was the woman. Sorry, I remember which woman it was. But anyway, that notion that white supremacy kind of has two competing agendas. One, where we'd like to have an all-white society and to kind of eliminate everybody who's not white from it, and yet how the economic engine of white supremacy is dependent on non-white people doing the labor, the menial jobs, the cleaning, the raising of the children, and how so much of our immigration policies can actually just be directly linked to that form of white supremacy, where we need labor for a while, so we bring in Chinese people to help with the railroads, and as soon as that task gets completed, we completely demonize them and like rush them out again, and then we need crops taken care of, or picked, and so we bring in Mexican folks, and then as soon as the tide changes on that, so you can almost just see where it's like, it almost feels erratic if you don't understand it, but then the idea that like it wants an all-white society, but it also wants periodic times where non-white people do all the menial labor, kind of is a fascinating way to think of how this kind of demonic enterprise kind of requires different things at different times in order to continue to survive and thrive. I thought that was really insightful.
Yeah, I agree. I wrote her quote down as soon as I heard it, which was difficult to do because I was running and watching on the treadmill. I was like, stop! But yeah, absolutely. That white supremacy wants whiteness, right, to dominate, but is also dependent on the continuous subjugation of communities of color in order to exploit economic advantage because of labor, cheap labor, and also that leads to social control, right, and oppression. It was really insightful. Thank you so much. We're hitting right at 9 o'clock here. And I know there's so much more. I hope you all come back next week. We're going to bring it a little bit more to our recent history in present day, and then talk about disruptions that have been made, resistance movements, disruptions, what this means for us as Christ followers, and how we've disrupted in the past and can maybe continue to understand and stand in solidarity with each other against these oppressive systems. So thank you so much, Christine. I'm going to volley it back to you. Pastor Christine, I don't know if you want to lead us in prayer. You have some closing thoughts or a mixture of the two?
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I'd love to close us out in prayer and make sure we're able to get on with our evenings. So thank you again for joining, and let's close out with a word of prayer. Oh, Lord God, we just thank you for this time. Lord, we thank you that you are a God who desires truth to be revealed, who desires your children to see you and know you more fully and deeply, to see and know one another more fully and deeply, and ourselves as well. And so, Lord, as we look back at our collective history as people in this country today, God, I just pray that you would do a work in our minds and our hearts as we go from this place, if there were things that were shared that are stirring something, Lord, would you cultivate that and grow that and reveal yourself through that? If there are things that feel hard or painful, would you attend to those needs in our spirits tonight? And God, I just thank you for the gift of community, of being able to explore some hard realities of our history, of our past together, and to process that together. I look forward to next week when we can have some more time for discussion. Yeah, Lord, we just submit it all to you, Lord, and ask that you would lead us and guide us in this journey towards justice, Lord. You are a God of justice. You are a God of freedom. You are a God of love. And we praise you for that and thank you, Lord, for who you are. We pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Hope you all have a wonderful evening. Oh, is there anything else?
Yeah, I'm gonna throw our emails in the chat, because I don't know if people, does your River City email still work, Christine, or do you want to do
I never had one, so my Gmail's good.
Okay, so I'm going to throw our, in case you have suggestions or any follow-up questions, it's ChristineChang1@gmail, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'll throw that in case y'all want to reach out, especially ahead of next week. If you have things in particular that you want to talk about, and we're definitely open to feedback as well, always. So yeah, anything else, Christine?
No, I think we're good.
All right, thank you all so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time, and I hope this was fruitful.
Good night, everyone.
All right, happy Monday.